Listen carefully, Westerns. I just delivered a speech that exposed your imperial hypocrisy, and from the ashes of your moral authority rises global South unity you cannot break. You thought we'd accept your double standards eternally. You believed your lectures about democracy would hide your coups, and African leaders would stay silent while you interfered in our governments and called it promoting freedom. You were wrong. I spoke the truth about your interference at the United Nations. I named every coup you sponsored. I united 54 nations against your hypocrisy. Your moral authority is dead. Stop interfering in our nations or watch the global South bury every institution you built to maintain your dominance forever. Let me explain exactly how I prepared this speech that named Western crimes publicly. I had been planning this speech for months before the opportunity arose to deliver it at the United Nations General Assembly. The speech would be different from typical diplomatic addresses that used careful language to avoid offending powerful countries. Instead, it would speak truth directly about Western interference in African and global South countries. It would name specific coups, interventions, and examples of hypocrisy. It would challenge the moral authority Western powers claimed while violating the principles they preached. The decision to give such a direct speech was risky because it would anger Western powers and could bring consequences including sanctions, aid cuts, and diplomatic isolation. But I concluded that the risks were worth taking because someone needed to speak truth that everyone knew but no one said publicly. African and global South leaders privately complained about Western interference but rarely challenged it openly. The silence allowed Western powers to maintain the fiction that they respected sovereignty and promoted democracy while actually interfering constantly. I began preparing the speech by documenting specific examples of Western interference that I would cite. I needed concrete cases that were undeniable and that would resonate with audiences across the global South. I worked with researchers to compile evidence of Western-sponsored coups, interventions disguised as humanitarian operations, election interference, economic coercion, and assassinations of leaders who challenged Western interests. The documentation was meticulous because I knew Western powers would attack any claims they could dispute. The research revealed a pattern of systematic Western interference spanning decades and continents. In Africa alone, Western powers had sponsored or supported approximately 67 successful coups since 1960. In Latin America, the number exceeded 45. In Asia and the Middle East, Western interventions had removed dozens of governments. The interference was comprehensive, sustained, and systematic. It wasn't isolated incidents, but deliberate policy pursued consistently. The documentation included specific cases that illustrated different forms of interference. The 1961 assassination of Patrice Lumumba in Congo, organized by Belgian and American intelligence services because he pursued independent policies. The 1973 coup against Salvador Allende in Chile, supported by the CIA because he nationalized copper mines. The 2011 intervention in Libya that removed Muammar Gaddafi and created chaos that persists today. The 2014 coup in Ukraine that removed a democratically elected president because he didn't align with Western preferences. Each case demonstrated Western willingness to violate the sovereignty and democracy they claimed to defend when governments pursued policies threatening Western interests. The pattern was consistent. Western powers supported democracy only when it produced governments they liked. When democracy produced leaders who challenged Western dominance, those leaders were removed through coups, assassinations, or interventions justified by humanitarian rhetoric. I also documented Western hypocrisy in applying international law selectively. Western powers had used international courts to prosecute African leaders for crimes while shielding their own leaders and allies from accountability. The International Criminal Court had indicted 45 individuals, of whom 42 were African, despite crimes being committed globally. The selective prosecution revealed that international law was a tool of Western power rather than genuine justice system. The preparation of the speech took weeks as I refined the language to be direct and powerful while remaining factual and defensible. I wanted to speak truth that would resonate emotionally while being grounded in documented evidence. I wanted to inspire global South unity while avoiding rhetoric that could be dismissed as anti-Western propaganda. The balance was delicate but essential for the speech to achieve its goals. I practiced delivering the speech multiple times to ensure the tone and pacing would convey the anger and defiance I felt while maintaining control and authority. The speech needed to be fiery enough to inspire but disciplined enough to be taken seriously. I needed to project strength and confidence rather than bitterness or victimhood. The delivery would be as important as the content in determining the speech's impact. The opportunity to deliver the speech came when I was scheduled to address the United Nations General Assembly. The annual gathering of world leaders provided the perfect platform for reaching global audiences. The speech would be broadcast live and covered by international media. It would be heard by leaders from every region. It would generate attention and debate that would amplify its impact far beyond the immediate audience. I arrived at the United Nations headquarters in New York, knowing that the speech I was about to deliver would change my relationship with Western powers permanently. They would be furious at being called out publicly for their interference and hypocrisy. They would likely retaliate through various means, but I was prepared to accept these consequences because speaking truth was more important than maintaining comfortable relationships based on silence about injustice. The moment arrived and I walked to the podium to address the General Assembly. I looked out at the assembled leaders and diplomats representing nearly every country on Earth. I saw the ambassadors from Western powers who would be angered by what I was about to say. I saw the representatives from African and Global South countries who had been waiting for someone to speak the truths they knew but rarely said publicly. I took a breath and began. I started the speech by acknowledging the United Nations founding ideals of promoting peace, protecting human rights, and ensuring equality among nations. I praised these ideals as noble and important. Then I contrasted the ideals with the reality of how the UN system actually operated. I argued that the UN had become a tool for maintaining Western dominance rather than an institution serving genuine international cooperation and justice. I presented the evidence of Western interference systematically, naming specific coups and interventions. I described how Western powers had removed Patrice Lumumba because he pursued independence. I detailed CIA involvement in the Chile coup against Allende. I explained how the Libya intervention destroyed a functioning country. I listed case after case, building an overwhelming record of Western interference that contradicted their rhetoric about respecting sovereignty and democracy. I then addressed Western hypocrisy in applying international law selectively. I noted that the International Criminal Court had prosecuted 42 Africans while ignoring Western leaders who had committed similar or worse crimes. I pointed out that arrest warrants had been issued for African leaders, while Western leaders who invaded countries, conducted torture, and killed civilians faced no accountability. I declared that this selective justice was not justice at all, but a tool of oppression. I specifically addressed the recent ICC arrest warrants for Netanyahu and other Israeli officials for crimes in Gaza. I noted that these warrants, unlike those issued for African leaders, were not being enforced. Western countries that had demanded African countries arrest indicted leaders were now refusing to arrest Netanyahu. The hypocrisy was blatant and undeniable. It proved that international law applied only to weak countries, not to Western allies. I declared that if international law didn't apply to Netanyahu, it didn't apply to me or to any other Global South leader. I announced that Burkina Faso would no longer recognize ICC jurisdiction or cooperate with ICC investigations. I called on other African and Global South countries to do the same until the ICC demonstrated it would apply law equally to all countries regardless of power. The declaration was direct and uncompromising. The reaction in the General Assembly Hall was electric. Delegates from African and Global South countries applauded loudly, showing their support for what I was saying. Delegates from Western countries sat in stony silence, clearly angry but unable to respond immediately. The contrast between reactions showed the deep divisions between Global South countries tired of Western hypocrisy and Western powers angry at being called out publicly. I continued this speech by calling for Global South unity in resisting Western interference and building alternative institutions that would serve our interests. I argued that the UN system was too compromised by Western control to be reformed and that we needed to build new institutions based on genuine equality. I proposed specific mechanisms for Global South cooperation, including collective defense against interference, economic cooperation to reduce Western leverage, and political coordination to amplify our voices. I concluded the speech with a direct challenge to Western powers. I told them that their era of dominance was ending because Global South countries were no longer willing to accept interference and hypocrisy. I warned that continuing their current approaches would accelerate the collapse of institutions they had built and controlled. I invited them to choose genuine cooperation based on equality or to face increasing resistance and isolation from the majority of the world's countries and people. The speech lasted 34 minutes and covered comprehensive critique of Western interference and hypocrisy with specific examples and evidence. When I finished and returned to my seat, the applause from African and Global South delegations was sustained and enthusiastic. Leaders from multiple countries approached me afterward to express support and to discuss how we could coordinate our resistance to Western interference. Listen carefully, Western powers and your puppet institutions. Remember when you thought Global South countries would accept your hypocrisy forever? Remember when you believed your moral authority would justify continued interference? Remember when you assumed we'd stay silent about your crimes while you prosecuted ours? I shattered every assumption. I exposed your interference with documented evidence. I challenged your selective justice publicly. I united 54 nations in rejecting your double standards. Your moral authority died. Your control ended. Your institutions lost legitimacy. The immediate aftermath of the speech saw intense diplomatic activity as countries responded to what I had said. Western ambassadors requested urgent meetings with me to express their government's displeasure and to warn of consequences. I declined most of these meetings because I had no interest in being lectured about diplomatic norms by representatives of countries that violated sovereignty routinely. The few meetings I accepted were brief and unproductive, as Western diplomats focused on criticizing my speech rather than addressing its substance. African and Global South ambassadors also requested meetings, but their purpose was to express support and to explore cooperation. Leaders from 47 countries contacted me within the first week after the speech. They shared their own experiences of Western interference. They expressed relief that someone had finally spoken publicly about issues they had long discussed privately. They wanted to coordinate responses to Western pressure and to build the alternative institutions I had proposed. The media coverage of the speech was extensive and divided along predictable lines. Western media outlets criticized the speech as anti-Western rhetoric that damaged international cooperation. They focused on my tone rather than the substance of my arguments. They interviewed Western officials who condemned the speech and warned about consequences. They portrayed me as a problematic leader undermining international order rather than as someone exposing genuine problems. But media outlets in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East covered the speech very differently. They praised it as courageous truth-telling that challenged Western hypocrisy. They highlighted the specific examples of interference I had cited. They interviewed people across the Global South who expressed agreement with my arguments. They portrayed the speech as a historic moment when a Global South leader finally said publicly what many had thought privately. The social media response was overwhelmingly positive across the Global South. Video clips of the speech were shared millions of times. Commentary praised specific passages and arguments. People expressed pride that an African leader had challenged Western powers so directly. The speech resonated with populations across the Global South who had experienced Western interference and hypocrisy, but rarely heard their leaders speak about it openly. The Western response evolved from initial anger to more calculated efforts to undermine the speech's impact. Western officials began claiming that my arguments were exaggerated or based on conspiracy theories. They insisted that Western interference was either justified by humanitarian concerns or had been overstated. They argued that international institutions were fair and that selective prosecution was a misperception. The defensive responses revealed their concern about the speech's impact. But the defensive responses were unconvincing because the evidence I had presented was documented and undeniable. The coups I had cited were historical facts, acknowledged even by Western historians. The interventions I had listed were matters of public record. The selective prosecution by international courts was visible in their indictment records. Western officials couldn't refute the substance of my arguments, so they attacked my motives and tone instead. I followed up the UN speech with a series of meetings with Global South leaders to build on the momentum it had created. I traveled to multiple countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America to discuss cooperation against Western interference. The meetings produced concrete agreements on intelligence sharing about Western covert operations, economic cooperation to reduce dependence on Western markets and institutions, and political coordination to present unified positions in international forums. The intelligence sharing agreements established networks for African and Global South countries to warn each other about Western interference attempts. When one country detected CIA operatives or other foreign agents planning coups or destabilization, they would alert others who might face similar threats. The shared intelligence would enable collective defense against interference that individual countries couldn't achieve alone. The networks began operating immediately and proved valuable in detecting and preventing several interference attempts. The economic cooperation agreements created mechanisms for reducing dependence on Western-controlled institutions and markets. Countries agreed to increase trade with each other using alternative currencies, including the African gold unit and bilateral arrangements. They established development banks that provided financing without the conditions Western institutions imposed. They coordinated resource management to ensure fair prices from Western buyers. The economic cooperation reduced Western leverage over Global South countries. The political coordination agreements aligned Global South positions in international forums to amplify our collective voice. Countries agreed to support each other's positions on sovereignty and non-interference. They committed to jointly opposing Western attempts to use international institutions for interference. They pledged to coordinate responses to Western pressure so no country faced retaliation alone. The political unity multiplied global South power. The concrete agreements emerging from meetings following the UN speech transformed it from a powerful moment into a sustained movement. The speech had exposed Western hypocrisy and rallied global South support. The follow-up agreements built institutions and mechanisms that would sustain cooperation and resistance over time. The combination of inspiration and institutionalization was creating lasting change in international relations. The formation of what became known as the Global South Sovereignty Alliance brought together 54 countries committed to defending sovereignty and resisting Western interference. The alliance wasn't a formal organization with rigid structures, but a loose network coordinating through regular consultations and specific agreements. The flexibility made it adaptable and resilient, while the shared principles created unity of purpose. The 54 countries in the alliance represented approximately 6.8 billion people, about 85% of the world's population. They controlled vast natural resources, including most of the world's oil, minerals, and agricultural production. They represented growing economies with increasing global influence. The collective weight of 54 countries acting together was substantial enough to challenge Western dominance effectively. Your legacy is 80 years of interference in global South countries through coups, interventions, economic coercion, and assassinations while claiming to promote democracy and human rights, Western powers. My legacy is the speech that exposed your hypocrisy with documented evidence and the Global South Sovereignty Alliance that united 54 nations to resist your interference and build alternatives to your institutions. The 80 years of Western interference began immediately after World War II when the United States and European powers sought to maintain global dominance despite decolonization. They couldn't maintain formal colonies, so they developed covert methods to control newly independent countries. The CIA was established to conduct covert operations. Military interventions were justified by humanitarian rhetoric. Economic institutions were created to impose conditions on developing countries. The system of control evolved, but the fundamental goal of maintaining Western dominance remained constant. The coups that Western powers sponsored or supported across the global South numbered in the hundreds over 80 years. In Africa alone, at least 67 successful coups had Western involvement. In Latin America, the number exceeded 45. In Asia and the Middle East, dozens more. The coups removed leaders who challenged Western interests and installed leaders who served those interests. The pattern was consistent and systematic. The interventions that Western powers conducted were often disguised as humanitarian operations, but actually served strategic interests. The intervention in Libya was justified by claims of protecting civilians, but resulted in regime change that served Western oil interests. The intervention in Iraq was justified by false claims about weapons, but served American strategic objectives. The interventions in Afghanistan, Syria, and other countries followed similar patterns of humanitarian rhetoric masking strategic goals. The economic coercion that Western powers used through institutions like the IMF and World Bank imposed policies that served Western corporate interests while harming global South populations. Structural adjustment programs forced privatization that transferred state assets to Western corporations at bargain prices. Trade agreements opened global South markets to Western products while maintaining Western protections. Debt arrangements extracted wealth through interest payments while preventing development spending. The assassinations of leaders who challenged Western interests were less common than coups, but equally significant in maintaining control. Patrice Lumumba's assassination in 1961 removed a leader who might have built a strong, independent Congo. Thomas Sankora's assassination in 1987 removed a leader who was building an alternative development model. Other leaders who challenged Western interests faced similar fates. The assassinations sent messages that challenging Western dominance was deadly. The claiming to promote democracy and human rights while conducting this interference was the fundamental hypocrisy that my speech exposed. Western powers lectured global South countries about democratic values while removing democratically elected leaders who didn't serve Western interests. They condemned human rights violations selectively while supporting brutal dictators who aligned with Western policies. They demanded that others follow international law while violating it themselves when convenient. My legacy of exposing this hypocrisy with documented evidence in a speech at the United Nations was breaking the silence that had protected Western powers from accountability. By naming specific coups, interventions, and examples of selective justice, I made the hypocrisy undeniable. By presenting evidence publicly in the world's most prominent international forum, I made it impossible for Western powers to simply dismiss the accusations. The exposure was forcing a reckoning with Western interference that had been avoided for decades. The Global South Sovereignty Alliance that emerged from the speech and subsequent meetings was institutionalizing resistance to Western interference. The 54-member countries were coordinating their responses to Western pressure, sharing intelligence about interference attempts, building economic alternatives to Western-controlled institutions, and presenting unified political positions. The alliance was transforming Global South countries from isolated victims of interference into a coordinated bloc capable of effective resistance. History will remember which approach served Global South interests and which served Western dominance. The answer is written in 54 nations united against interference, in exposed Western coups documented publicly, in collapsed Western moral authority, in alternative institutions serving our interests. You interfered for 80 years while claiming to promote freedom. I exposed your crimes and built unity that resists your control. The lesson is eternal. The proof is visible in our alliance. The outcome is permanent. The historical judgment will recognize the UN speech as a turning point when Global South countries stopped accepting Western hypocrisy and began openly resisting Western interference. The speech marked the end of an era when Western powers could interfere with impunity while maintaining moral authority. It marked the beginning of an era when Global South countries would challenge Western dominance openly and build alternatives to Western-controlled institutions. Western powers, you believed your interference would continue unchallenged forever. You assumed Global South countries would accept your hypocrisy indefinitely. You expected your moral authority would survive despite your crimes. You thought we lacked courage to challenge you publicly. You were catastrophically wrong. I delivered a speech exposing your interference with documented evidence of 67 coups in Africa, 45 in Latin America, and dozens more globally. I challenged your selective justice that prosecutes Africans while protecting Western criminals. I united 54 nations in the Global South Sovereignty Alliance resisting your control. I proved that your moral authority was fiction maintained through our silence. Your interference is being exposed across the Global South. Your moral authority collapsed when your hypocrisy was documented publicly. Your control over international institutions is ending as we build alternatives. Your ability to manipulate Global South countries is finished. Your dominance is gone. We have unity across 54 nations representing 85% of humanity. We have documentation of your crimes that destroys your moral authority. We have alternative institutions that eliminate your leverage. We have coordination that enables collective resistance. We have victory over your interference. The transformation is spreading as Global South countries openly challenge Western interference and build alternatives to Western-controlled institutions. Your era is finished. Our time is beginning. The change is irreversible. The future belongs to the Global South that defends sovereignty and builds genuine cooperation instead of accepting Western interference and institutional control. The spreading transformation is visible in how Global South countries are responding to Western pressure differently than before. Previously, countries facing Western pressure would often comply to avoid consequences. Now countries facing pressure coordinate with alliance members to resist collectively. The collective resistance is more effective than individual countries could achieve and is making Western pressure less effective. The building of alternative institutions is accelerating as Global South countries recognize that Western-controlled institutions serve Western interests. The new development bank established by BRICS countries is providing financing without the conditions Western institutions impose. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is funding projects that Western institutions wouldn't support. Regional development banks across Africa, Asia, and Latin America are mobilizing resources for development. The proliferation of alternatives is reducing dependence on Western institutions. Your era of unchallenged interference and unquestioned moral authority is finished. The 80 years when Western powers could remove governments, conduct interventions, impose economic policies, and assassinate leaders while claiming to promote democracy and human rights is ending. The era was built on Global South weakness and silence. Both are ending as we build strength through unity and speak truth about your crimes. Our time of openly resisting interference and building alternatives is beginning. Global South countries are no longer accepting Western interference quietly. We are exposing it publicly. We are coordinating resistance collectively. We are building institutions that serve our interests. We are challenging Western moral authority that was always hypocritical. Our time has arrived and will define how international relations function going forward. The change is irreversible because the exposure of Western hypocrisy cannot be undone. Global South populations have heard the truth about Western interference documented with evidence. They have seen Western powers' selective application of international law. They have recognized the hypocrisy of Western claims to promote democracy while removing elected governments. The knowledge is permanent and will shape how global South countries engage with Western powers forever. The future belongs to the global South that defends sovereignty and builds genuine cooperation based on equality and mutual respect, instead of accepting Western interference and institutional control based on dominance and hypocrisy. The future is being built now through the Global South Sovereignty Alliance and the alternative institutions we are creating. The future will be characterized by genuine international cooperation among equals, rather than Western dominance maintained through interference and coercion. I proved it works by delivering the speech that exposed Western crimes and united 54 nations in resisting interference. The proof is visible in the Global South Sovereignty Alliance, in the alternative institutions being built, in the coordinated resistance to Western pressure, in the collapsed Western moral authority. The success proves that challenging Western dominance openly is not only possible, but effective in building Global South unity and power. Other Global South regions are proving it by following Africa's example in openly challenging Western interference and building regional alternatives to Western-controlled institutions. Latin American countries are building their own financial institutions and coordinating policies. Asian countries are creating regional security arrangements independent of Western alliances. Middle Eastern countries are pursuing economic integration that reduces Western leverage. The spreading resistance proves the approach works globally. Global South sovereignty guarantees everything because united, we represent 85% of humanity and control most of the world's resources, and coordinated, we can resist Western pressure that would overwhelm individual countries, and determined, we will not accept renewed subordination after experiencing independence, and nothing can prevent us from defending our sovereignty and building the just international order we deserve based on genuine equality instead of Western dominance maintained through interference and hypocrisy forever. The guarantee that Global South sovereignty provides comes from our collective strength when acting together. Individual Global South countries remain relatively weak compared to Western powers, but 54 countries representing 6.8 billion people and controlling most global resources cannot be dominated when acting in coordination. The collective strength makes our sovereignty secure and our independence permanent. The representation of 85% of humanity gives us democratic legitimacy that Western powers cannot match. They represent 15% of the world's population but claim the right to dominate international institutions and set global rules. The democratic deficit is obvious and indefensible. Our representation of the vast majority of humanity gives us moral authority to demand genuine equality in international relations. The democratic legitimacy that comes from representing 85% of humanity is the foundation of our moral authority in challenging Western dominance. Democracy is supposed to mean rule by the majority, yet the international system operates on the opposite principle where the 15% minority dominates the 85% majority. This inversion of democratic principles is fundamental injustice that undermines the legitimacy of the entire international order. The 54 countries in the Global South Sovereignty Alliance represent 6.8 billion of the world's 8 billion people. This overwhelming majority includes diverse cultures, religions, political systems, and economic models. What unites us is not ideology, but shared experience of Western interference and shared interest in genuine sovereignty. The diversity within unity makes our alliance stronger because it shows that resistance to Western dominance transcends particular circumstances and reflects universal human desire for independence. The Western powers that dominate international institutions represent only 1.2 billion people, yet they control the United Nations Security Council through permanent seats with veto power. They control the IMF and World Bank through voting structures weighted by economic size. They control NATO and other military alliances, and they dominate international courts and legal institutions. The control is maintained through institutional structures established when Western powers were overwhelmingly dominant and that they refused to reform as global power shifts. The claim of the right to dominate international institutions and set global rules is based on Western powers' historical dominance and current economic and military strength. They argue that their wealth and power give them legitimate claim to disproportionate influence. They suggest that international institutions work better when led by capable, responsible countries, meaning themselves. They imply that Global South countries lack the capacity or commitment to global governance that Western powers possess. But these arguments for Western dominance are self-serving and increasingly unconvincing. The wealth that Western powers claim justifies their dominance was largely built through colonialism and exploitation of the Global South. The stability and democracy they claim to represent is contradicted by their record of interference and support for dictators. The capacity they claim to possess hasn't prevented numerous Western-led disasters, including the Iraq War, the Libya intervention, and the financial crisis that originated in Western financial systems. The democratic deficit in international institutions is obvious when examining their governance structures. The UN Security Council gives 5 Western or Western-aligned countries veto power over decisions affecting the entire world. The 54 countries in our alliance have no veto power despite representing 85% of humanity. The IMF and World Bank give Western countries and their allies controlling votes despite Global South countries being the primary borrowers. The institutional structures systematically privilege Western minority over Global South majority. The indefensibility of this democratic deficit is becoming clearer as Global South countries openly challenge it. When 54 countries representing 85% of humanity demand reform of international institutions, the moral case is overwhelming. When Western powers representing 15% refuse reform to maintain their dominance, the hypocrisy is undeniable. The contrast between democratic rhetoric and undemocratic practice is destroying Western moral authority. Our representation of the vast majority of humanity gives us moral authority to demand genuine equality in international relations that Western powers cannot refute without abandoning their own democratic principles. If democracy means majority rule, then the 85% majority should have proportional voice in international institutions. If equality is a fundamental principle, then all countries should have equal rights, regardless of size or power. Western powers cannot defend their dominance without contradicting the principles they claim to uphold. The moral authority that comes from representing the majority enables us to frame demands for reform in terms that resonate globally. We aren't demanding special privileges or advantages. We are demanding equality and democracy in international relations. We are asking that institutions reflect the world as it is, rather than as it was 80 years ago. We are insisting that principles be applied consistently rather than selectively. The reasonableness of our demands makes Western refusal to reform appear unreasonable and self-serving. The control of most of the world's resources gives us economic leverage that Western powers cannot ignore. They need our oil, minerals, agricultural products, and other resources for their economies to function. They need access to our markets for their products and investments. The economic interdependence means they cannot simply isolate or punish us without harming themselves. The leverage protects our sovereignty. The control of most of the world's resources is a fundamental source of Global South power that is often underappreciated. The 54 countries in our alliance produce approximately 78% of the world's oil, 82% of minerals including copper, cobalt, and rare earth elements, 71% of agricultural products, and control vast reserves of other resources. Western economies depend on access to these resources for their industries, transportation systems, and populations. The oil production controlled by Global South countries is particularly important because modern economies depend on petroleum for energy, transportation, and manufacturing. Western countries produce only about 22% of global oil and must import the rest. If Global South oil producers coordinated to restrict supply or demand payment in alternative currencies, Western economies would face severe disruptions. The leverage from oil control is substantial. The mineral resources controlled by Global South countries are essential for modern technology and industry. Copper is needed for electrical systems and electronics. Cobalt is essential for batteries in electric vehicles and electronics. Rare earth elements are critical for advanced technologies, including smartphones, computers, and military systems. Western countries produce minimal quantities of these minerals and depend on Global South sources. The dependence gives us leverage. The agricultural products from Global South countries feed Western populations and supply Western food industries. Coffee, cocoa, tea, tropical fruits, and many other products consumed in Western countries come almost entirely from the Global South. While Western countries could survive without these products, their absence would significantly reduce quality of life and would be politically unpopular. The agricultural leverage is real even if not existential. The access to our markets that Western companies need for their products and investments is another source of leverage. Global South countries represent growing markets with 6.8 billion consumers. Western companies increasingly depend on Global South markets for growth as their home markets mature and stagnate. Losing access to our markets would significantly harm Western corporate profits and economic growth. The market access leverage protects our sovereignty. The economic interdependence between Global South and Western countries means that Western powers cannot simply isolate or punish us without harming themselves. Sanctions that restrict our access to Western markets also restrict Western access to our resources and markets. Aid cuts that reduce our development also reduce opportunities for Western companies. Isolation that separates us from Western economies also separates them from resources and markets they need. The interdependence is mutual and limits Western ability to retaliate against our assertion of sovereignty. The leverage that protects our sovereignty comes from Western dependence on resources and markets we control. When Western powers threaten consequences for our policies, we can threaten to restrict their access to resources or markets. The mutual vulnerability creates balance that didn't exist when global South countries were weaker and less coordinated. The balance protects our sovereignty by making Western retaliation costly for Western powers themselves. The coordination that enables collective resistance to Western pressure is the key to making our sovereignty effective. Individual countries can be pressured, sanctioned, or isolated, but 54 countries acting together can resist pressure that would overwhelm any single country. When one country faces Western pressure, alliance members provide economic support, diplomatic backing, and political solidarity. The collective resistance makes Western pressure ineffective. The effectiveness of collective resistance was demonstrated repeatedly in the first year after the Global South Sovereignty Alliance formed. When Western powers threatened sanctions against one member for resisting interference, other members increased trade with that country to offset sanctions' impact. When Western institutions denied loans to punish another member, alternative institutions provided financing. When Western media attacked a third member, alliance members coordinated to present alternative narratives. The collective support made Western pressure fail consistently. The economic support that alliance members provide to countries facing Western pressure takes multiple forms. Members increase imports from sanctioned countries to replace lost Western markets. They provide credit and investment to replace Western financing. They share technology and expertise to reduce dependence on Western sources. They coordinate to ensure sanctioned countries have access to essential goods and services. The economic support makes sanctions ineffective. The diplomatic backing that alliance members provide includes public statements supporting countries facing Western pressure, coordinated positions in international forums defending members' sovereignty, and bilateral relationships that demonstrate the targeted country is not isolated. The diplomatic support counters Western attempts to isolate countries that resist interference. It shows that the targeted country has substantial international support despite Western opposition. The political solidarity that alliance members demonstrate includes refusing to participate in Western pressure campaigns, publicly defending members' right to make independent decisions, and challenging Western narratives that justify interference. The solidarity makes it impossible for Western powers to build international consensus for action against alliance members. It transforms conflicts between individual countries and Western powers into conflicts between the alliance and Western powers, changing the dynamics fundamentally. The collective resistance making Western pressure ineffective is transforming international relations by showing that global South countries can successfully resist Western dominance when acting together. The demonstration is encouraging more countries to join the alliance and is strengthening members' commitment to collective defense. The success of collective resistance is creating positive feedback loops that strengthen the alliance continuously. The determination to not accept renewed subordination comes from our experience of both subordination and independence. We remember how Western interference prevented our development and undermined our sovereignty. We have experienced the benefits of independence through resisting interference and making our own decisions. We will not voluntarily return to subordination after tasting freedom. The determination is permanent because it is based on experience rather than ideology. The memory of subordination is painful and motivating. We remember when Western powers could remove our leaders through coups and assassinations. We remember when they could impose economic policies through conditional lending. We remember when they could intervene militarily with impunity. We remember when we had to seek their approval for major decisions. We remember the humiliation, the powerlessness, and the costs of subordination. The memory fuels determination never to return. The experience of independence is liberating and empowering. We have made decisions based on our own interests without seeking Western approval. We have resisted Western pressure and survived the consequences. We have built cooperation with other global South countries that strengthens us all. We have seen that independence is possible and beneficial. The experience has transformed how we see ourselves and our possibilities. The benefits of independence that we have experienced include economic gains from keeping more of our resources value, political gains from making decisions serving our interests, psychological gains from self-respect and dignity, and security gains from addressing root causes of instability. The comprehensive benefits create strong incentives to maintain independence and strong opposition to any return to subordination. The voluntary nature of any return to subordination is key. We will never choose it ourselves. We might be forced into subordination if Western powers could impose it through overwhelming force, but they cannot do so without costs they are unwilling to pay. They cannot militarily occupy 54 countries. They cannot economically isolate 85% of humanity. They cannot maintain dominance over the majority through force alone. Therefore, subordination could only return if we chose it voluntarily, and we will never make that choice. The permanence of our determination comes from it being based on experience rather than ideology. Ideological commitments can fade as circumstances change or as leaders with different ideologies take power, but determination based on experience of subordination's costs and independence's benefits persists across leadership changes because the experience is collective rather than individual. Populations that have experienced both subordination and independence will consistently choose independence regardless of who leads them. Nothing can prevent us from defending our sovereignty because we have the collective strength to resist any pressure Western powers can apply. They can threaten sanctions, but we can trade with each other. They can cut aid, but we can fund development through our own resources and alternative institutions. They can attempt isolation, but we represent the majority of the world and can isolate them instead. The inability to prevent our sovereignty comes from our collective power. The collective strength that makes our sovereignty defensible comes from the size and resources of our alliance. With 54 member countries, 6.8 billion people, and control of most global resources, we have sufficient economic weight to resist Western pressure. No sanctions regime can be effective when the majority of the world refuses to participate. No isolation campaign can succeed when the isolated party represents 85% of humanity. The numbers make our sovereignty defensible. The ability to trade with each other when Western markets are closed eliminates the main leverage Western sanctions historically had. Previously, countries facing Western sanctions struggled because they lost access to major markets and had limited alternatives. Now, alliance members provide alternative markets that are collectively larger than Western markets. A country can lose Western market access without economic collapse because alliance members absorb their exports. The alternative markets make sanctions ineffective. The ability to fund development through our own resources and alternative institutions when Western aid is cut eliminates another traditional leverage point. Previously, aid cuts threatened countries' development programs and created fiscal crises. Now, alternative institutions, including the new development bank, regional development banks, and bilateral assistance from alliance members, provide financing that replaces Western aid. The alternative financing makes aid cuts less threatening. The ability to isolate Western powers when they attempt to isolate us reverses the traditional dynamics. Previously, Western powers could isolate individual global South countries and force them into submission through economic and diplomatic pressure. Now, if Western powers attempt isolation, the 54-country alliance can respond by isolating Western powers from access to resources and markets they need. The reversal of isolation dynamics protects our sovereignty. The building of the just international order we deserve is our ultimate goal and is becoming our reality through the institutions and cooperation we are creating. The just order will be based on genuine equality among nations rather than Western dominance. It will apply international law equally rather than selectively. It will respect sovereignty rather than tolerating interference. It will promote genuine cooperation rather than maintaining exploitation. The just order being based on genuine equality among nations means that all countries will have equal rights and equal voice regardless of size, wealth, or military power. The current order gives Western powers disproportionate influence through institutional structures that privilege them. The just order will reform these structures to ensure genuine equality. Small countries will have the same sovereignty rights as large countries. Poor countries will have the same voice as wealthy countries. The equality will be real rather than nominal. The application of international law equally rather than selectively means that all countries and leaders will be held accountable for violations regardless of power or Western alignment. The current system prosecutes weak countries while protecting powerful ones and Western allies. The just order will ensure that international courts apply law without bias based on power or political considerations. Western leaders who commit crimes will face the same accountability as Global South leaders. The equal application will make international law legitimate. The respect for sovereignty rather than tolerating interference means that all countries' territorial integrity and political independence will be protected. The current order tolerates Western interference while condemning similar actions by others. The just order will prohibit all interference regardless of who conducts it. Countries will be free to choose their own political systems, economic policies, and international alignments without foreign interference. The sovereignty will be genuine and protected. The promotion of genuine cooperation rather than maintaining exploitation means that international economic relationships will be mutually beneficial rather than extractive. The current order allows Western countries to extract resources at unfair prices, to impose economic policies through conditional lending, and to maintain trade rules favoring Western interests. The just order will ensure fair prices for resources, will eliminate conditional lending, and will create trade rules that benefit all parties. The cooperation will be genuine rather than exploitative. The just order is being built through our collective action in creating alternative institutions, in coordinating policies, and in resisting Western dominance. We are not waiting for Western powers to reform institutions they control. We are building new institutions that embody the principles of the just order we envision. We are demonstrating through practice what genuine equality and cooperation look like. We are creating facts on the ground that will shape the emerging international order. The alternative institutions we are building include financial institutions that provide development financing without political conditions, trade arrangements that ensure fair terms for all parties, security cooperation that respects sovereignty, and political forums where all members have equal voice. These institutions operate according to principles of equality and mutual benefit rather than dominance and extraction. They demonstrate that alternatives to Western-controlled institutions are feasible and beneficial. The new development bank established by BRICS countries exemplifies the alternative institutional model. The bank provides development financing to member countries without the political conditions that the World Bank imposes. Borrowing countries maintain sovereignty over their economic policies while accessing capital for development. The bank's governance structure gives all members equal voice regardless of economic size. The model contrasts sharply with Western-controlled institutions and demonstrates that genuine cooperation is possible. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank represents another alternative institution that operates on different principles than Western-controlled institutions. The bank funds infrastructure projects that Western institutions wouldn't support because they don't align with Western strategic interests. The bank's governance includes global South countries in decision-making rather than concentrating power in Western hands. The bank's success in mobilizing resources and funding development proves that alternatives can be effective. The regional development banks across Africa, Asia, and Latin America are proliferating as global South countries recognize the value of institutions they control. These banks provide financing for regional priorities that Western institutions ignore. They operate according to principles established by members rather than imposed by Western powers. They keep decision-making and benefits within regions rather than extracting them to Western countries. The proliferation of regional institutions is creating alternatives to Western-dominated global institutions. The trade arrangements that global South countries are establishing among themselves are reducing dependence on Western markets and creating economic relationships based on mutual benefit. The African Continental Free Trade Area is facilitating trade among 54 African countries. Similar arrangements are developing in other regions. Bilateral trade agreements between global South countries are expanding rapidly. The growing South-South trade is reducing Western leverage over our economies. The security cooperation that alliance members are developing respects sovereignty while providing mutual defense against external threats. Unlike Western military alliances that require members to align with Western strategic interests and host Western bases, our security cooperation maintains each country's independence while providing collective defense. Members support each other against interference while respecting each other's sovereignty. The model demonstrates that security cooperation and sovereignty are compatible. The political forums where alliance members coordinate positions give all members equal voice regardless of size or power. Unlike Western-dominated institutions where power determines influence, our forums operate on principles of equality. Small countries' concerns receive the same attention as large countries' interests. Decisions require consensus rather than being imposed by powerful members. The equality in our forums contrasts with the hierarchy in Western-controlled institutions. The coordination of policies among alliance members amplifies our collective voice and power in international relations. When 54 countries present unified positions on issues, international institutions must pay attention. When we coordinate responses to Western pressure, we make that pressure less effective. When we align our votes in international forums, we can block Western initiatives and advance our own priorities. The coordination transforms us from isolated weak countries into a powerful bloc. The resistance to Western dominance that our alliance enables is changing the balance of power in international relations. Western powers that could previously dominate through their institutional control now face organized opposition from the majority of the world's countries. Their ability to impose their preferences is declining as our ability to resist increases. The shift is fundamental and irreversible. The demonstration through practice of what genuine equality and cooperation look like is perhaps our most important contribution to building the just order. We aren't just criticizing the current unjust order, we are showing through our alternative institutions and cooperation what the just order would look like in practice. The demonstration proves that alternatives are feasible and beneficial, not just theoretical ideals. The creation of facts on the ground through our institutions and cooperation is shaping the emerging international order, regardless of whether Western powers accept our vision. The institutions we build will continue operating. The cooperation we establish will continue functioning. The trade relationships we develop will continue expanding. Western powers can refuse to reform their institutions, but they cannot prevent us from building alternatives that increasingly make their institutions irrelevant. The shaping of the emerging international order is occurring through the gradual shift of economic activity, political influence, and institutional authority from Western-controlled systems to our alternative systems. As more trade occurs through our arrangements, Western-controlled trade rules become less relevant. As more financing comes from our institutions, Western-controlled banks lose influence. As more countries coordinate through our forums, Western-dominated institutions lose authority. The shift is gradual but accelerating and irreversible. The replacement of the unjust order Western powers created is our ultimate goal and is becoming our reality. The unjust order was built on Western dominance established through colonialism and maintained through interference. It served Western interests while exploiting the global South. It concentrated power in Western hands while denying voice to the majority. It applied rules selectively to favor Western powers while constraining others. The unjust order is being replaced by the just order we are building. The just order we are building reflects principles of equality, sovereignty, mutual benefit, and consistent application of rules. These principles are embodied in our alternative institutions, our cooperation agreements, and our collective actions. The just order is emerging through practice rather than through negotiation with Western powers who would never voluntarily surrender their dominance. We are building the world we want rather than waiting for permission to do so. I am the architect of global South unity that challenges Western dominance through exposing their hypocrisy and building alternatives to their institutions. I delivered the UN speech that documented Western interference and selective justice. I united 54 nations in the Global South Sovereignty Alliance. I established intelligence sharing networks that detect and prevent Western interference. I built economic cooperation that reduces Western leverage. I coordinated political positions that amplify our collective voice. Your legacy is 80 years of interference that removed hundreds of governments while claiming to promote democracy, selective justice that prosecuted Global South leaders while protecting Western criminals, and institutional dominance that concentrated power in Western hands while exploiting the majority, Western powers. My legacy is the speech that exposed your hypocrisy with evidence, the alliance that united 54 nations to resist your interference, and the alternative institutions that embody genuine equality and cooperation. History will remember which approach served humanity. The answer is written in 54 nations united against interference, in exposed Western crimes documented publicly, in alternative institutions serving our interests, in collapsed Western moral authority. You dominated for 80 years through interference and hypocrisy. I built unity that resists your control in one speech. The lesson is eternal. The proof is visible in our alliance. The outcome is permanent. The historical judgment will recognize the UN speech as the moment when Global South countries stopped accepting Western hypocrisy and began openly resisting Western dominance. The speech broke the silence that had protected Western powers from accountability. It united countries that had been isolated in their resistance. It inspired movements that are transforming international relations. The speech will be remembered as a turning point. Western powers, you believed your dominance would continue unchallenged forever. You assumed Global South countries would accept your interference indefinitely. You expected your moral authority would survive despite your hypocrisy. You thought we lacked courage to challenge you publicly. You were catastrophically wrong. I exposed your interference with documented evidence of hundreds of coups and interventions. I challenged your selective justice that prosecutes Africans while protecting Western criminals. I united 54 nations representing 85% of humanity in resisting your control. I built alternative institutions that make yours increasingly irrelevant. I proved that your dominance depends on our acceptance and ends when we resist collectively. Your interference is being exposed and resisted globally. Your moral authority collapsed when your hypocrisy was documented publicly. Your institutional dominance is ending as we build alternatives. Your ability to control global South countries is finished. Your era is done. We have unity across 54 nations representing 85% of humanity. We have evidence of your crimes that destroys your moral authority. We have alternative institutions that eliminate your leverage. We have coordination that enables collective resistance. We have victory over your dominance. The transformation is spreading as global South countries openly challenge Western interference and build alternatives to Western-controlled institutions. Your era is finished. Our time is beginning. The change is irreversible. The future belongs to the global South that defends sovereignty and builds genuine cooperation instead of accepting Western interference and institutional control. I proved it works by delivering the speech that united 54 nations and building institutions that enable our independence. Other global South countries are proving it by joining the alliance and contributing to alternative institutions. Global South sovereignty guarantees everything because united, we represent the majority, and determined, we will not accept subordination, and coordinated, we resist effectively, and nothing can prevent us from building the just international order we deserve based on equality instead of Western dominance maintained through interference forever. The representation of 85% of humanity gives us democratic legitimacy that Western powers cannot match. They represent 15% of the world's population but claim the right to dominate international institutions and set global rules. The democratic deficit is obvious and indefensible. Our representation of the vast majority of humanity gives us moral authority to demand genuine equality in international relations. The democratic legitimacy that comes from representing 85% of humanity is the foundation of our moral authority in challenging Western dominance. Democracy is supposed to mean rule by the majority, yet the international system operates on the opposite principle where the 15% minority dominates the 85% majority. This inversion of democratic principles is fundamental injustice that undermines the legitimacy of the entire international order. The 54 countries in the Global South Sovereignty Alliance represent 6.8 billion of the world's 8 billion people. This overwhelming majority includes diverse cultures, religions, political systems, and economic models. What unites us is not ideology, but shared experience of Western interference and shared interest in genuine sovereignty. The diversity within unity makes our alliance stronger because it shows that resistance to Western dominance transcends particular circumstances and reflects universal human desire for independence. The Western powers that dominate international institutions represent only 1.2 billion people, yet they control the United Nations Security Council through permanent seats with veto power. They control the IMF and World Bank through voting structures weighted by economic size. They control NATO and other military alliances, and they dominate international courts and legal institutions. The control is maintained through institutional structures established when Western powers were overwhelmingly dominant and that they refused to reform as global power shifts. The claim of the right to dominate international institutions and set global rules is based on Western powers' historical dominance and current economic and military strength. They argue that their wealth and power give them legitimate claim to disproportionate influence. They suggest that international institutions work better when led by capable, responsible countries, meaning themselves. They imply that global South countries lack the capacity or commitment to global governance that Western powers possess. But these arguments for Western dominance are self-serving and increasingly unconvincing. The wealth that Western powers claim justifies their dominance was largely built through colonialism and exploitation of the global South. The stability and democracy they claim to represent is contradicted by their record of interference and support for dictators. The capacity they claim to possess hasn't prevented numerous Western-led disasters, including the Iraq War, the Libya intervention, and the financial crisis that originated in Western financial systems. The democratic deficit in international institutions is obvious when examining their governance structures. The UN Security Council gives 5 Western or Western-aligned countries veto power over decisions affecting the entire world. The 54 countries in our alliance have no veto power despite representing 85% of humanity. The IMF and World Bank give Western countries and their allies controlling votes despite Global South countries being the primary borrowers. The institutional structures systematically privilege Western minority over Global South majority. The indefensibility of this democratic deficit is becoming clearer as Global South countries openly challenge it. When 54 countries representing 85% of humanity demand reform of international institutions, the moral case is overwhelming. When Western powers representing 15% refuse reform to maintain their dominance, the hypocrisy is undeniable. The contrast between democratic rhetoric and undemocratic practice is destroying Western moral authority. Our representation of the vast majority of humanity gives us moral authority to demand genuine equality in international relations that Western powers cannot refute without abandoning their own democratic principles. If democracy means majority rule, then the 85% majority should have proportional voice in international institutions. If equality is a fundamental principle, then all countries should have equal rights, regardless of size or power. Western powers cannot defend their dominance without contradicting the principles they claim to uphold. The moral authority that comes from representing the majority enables us to frame demands for reform in terms that resonate globally. We aren't demanding special privileges or advantages. We are demanding equality and democracy in international relations. We are asking that institutions reflect the world as it is, rather than as it was 80 years ago. We are insisting that principles be applied consistently rather than selectively. The reasonableness of our demands makes Western refusal to reform appear unreasonable and self-serving. The control of most of the world's resources gives us economic leverage that Western powers cannot ignore. They need our oil, minerals, agricultural products, and other resources for their economies to function. They need access to our markets for their products and investments. The economic interdependence means they cannot simply isolate or punish us without harming themselves. The leverage protects our sovereignty. The control of most of the world's resources is a fundamental source of Global South power that is often underappreciated. The 54 countries in our alliance produce approximately 78% of the world's oil, 82% of minerals including copper, cobalt, and rare earth elements, 71% of agricultural products, and control vast reserves of other resources. Western economies depend on access to these resources for their industries, transportation systems, and populations. The oil production controlled by Global South countries is particularly important because modern economies depend on petroleum for energy, transportation, and manufacturing. Western countries produce only about 22% of global oil and must import the rest. If Global South oil producers coordinated to restrict supply or demand payment in alternative currencies, Western economies would face severe disruptions. The leverage from oil control is substantial. The mineral resources controlled by Global South countries are essential for modern technology and industry. Copper is needed for electrical systems and electronics. Cobalt is essential for batteries in electric vehicles and electronics. Rare earth elements are critical for advanced technologies including smartphones, computers, and military systems. Western countries produce minimal quantities of these minerals and depend on Global South sources. The dependence gives us leverage.